Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a book that looks at something fundamental and, frankly, pretty unnerving about American public life.
Yeah, it's about why it sometimes feels like, facts and expertise are just constantly under assault.
Exactly. Our source for this deep dive is Charles P. Pierce's provocative book, Idiot America: How Stupidity Became a Virtue.
Right. And Pierce basically argues that the landscape has shifted, where being loud often counts for more than being right, and belief can just kind of steamroll evidence.
So our mission in this deep dive is to, well, walk through the terrain Pierce maps out. We want to pull out the core ideas, the surprising insights, maybe.
Yeah, and connect the dots on what he calls the war on expertise.
Right, and how this environment, this idiot America, actually operates.
We'll look at its history, which is kind of strange.
Uh-huh. And the role of media, big one.
Huge. And how this stuff plays out in, well, everything from science and religion debates to, politics and even national policy.
And hopefully along the way, we can give you, our listener, maybe a framework for spotting these dynamics in the information that's just swirling around you every day.
Absolutely.
So let's start with Pierce's foundational idea, the uniquely American crank. He argues America has always been like fertile ground for these public cranks, people operating outside the mainstream.
Yeah, he traces this back pretty far, suggesting it's tied to early American thought even. Charles Freeman, for instance, points out that older traditions often gave irrationality the status of, well, universal truth.
You mean like preferring divine revelation over reason?
Sort of, yeah. Or maybe uneducated faith over what you could figure out through logic.
So the founders, like Madison, they were trying to steer away from that.
Exactly. I mean, they were Enlightenment guys. They envisioned an educated citizenry. But, even Madison, looking back later, saw the U.S. Constitution as having these safety valves.
Safety valves. For what?
Mechanisms to accommodate the, let's say, infirmities inherent in any human system. He felt the country was built with room for people to, as Pierce puts it, go completely around the bend.
Huh. Okay. But there's a really crucial distinction Pierce makes about these historical cranks, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely key. They weren't necessarily seeking fame or fortune.
Right.
The historical crank worked diligently, often on the fringes. Like, think of someone obsessed with finding Atlantis.
Okay.
They poured years into researching obscure texts, weird maps, whatever. Pierce argues these people, even when they were totally wrong, sometimes stretched the boundaries of, political, cultural, intellectual imagination.
Just because it required effort to engage with them, to either disprove their ideas or maybe find a tiny kernel of truth.
Precisely. Their value, Pierce suggests, was in the effort it took to refute or assimilate their ideas. That whole process broadened horizons. They weren't getting automatic book deals or TV spots just for having a wild theory.
Which brings us to now, the modern landscape, where that seems to have fundamentally changed. Pierce quotes that Paul Newman line from The Sting.
Oh, yeah. There's no point in being a grifter if it's the same as being a citizen.
And that hits it, right. Because today, the cranks aren't necessarily stuck on the margins.
Not at all. They do get book deals. They do get TV shows. Pierce argues the margins have moved, or maybe the center just swallowed them whole.
And he puts a lot of the blame for this shift, this enabling of idiot America, squarely on television.
Yeah, TV, it seems like a source of info, right? But Pierce argues its structure fundamentally changes how we process facts.
How so?
Well, there's just so much content that fact becomes like whatever enough people believe for TV to even notice it.
And truth.
Truth, he suggests, is less about accuracy and more about how fervently someone believes it. The main driver isn't education, it's entertainment, it's ratings.
That's a pretty stark point Keith Olbermann makes,
Yeah.
which Pierce quotes. Something about credibility.
Yeah, you don't need to be credible. All these things we used to associate with what we do are no longer factors. Oof.
Wow.
And this whole environment, according to Pierce, operates under what he calls the three great premises of idiot America.
Okay.
These aren't just like casual observations. They represent a fundamental rewiring of how information works in public life. The core idea. Truth isn't about evidence anymore. It's about whether enough people believe something loudly enough.
Okay, let's break those down. The three premises.
First, any theory is valid if it moves units, meaning if it gets ratings, sells books, makes money, whatever.
Got it. Premise 2.
Second, anything can be true if someone says it loudly enough.
And the third one. This feels crucial.
Yeah, the third is maybe the most important. Fact is simply that which enough people believe. And truth. Truth is measured by how fervently they believe it.
So volume, popularity, intensity.
Yeah.
They replace verification, reasoned argument.
Pretty much.
Talk radio seems like a perfect illustration of this, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Pierce sees talk radio as existing because, well, as consultant Holland Cook puts it, it generates revenue. Simple as that.
And its roots go back.
Yeah, figures like Father Charles Coughlin. Pierce suggests it functions today as a kind of continuous conversation between Coughlins.
He uses some pretty intense examples of figures amplified by this medium, like Gordon Liddy.
Yeah, Liddy, infamous from Watergate, right. But he transformed into this media celebrity. Pierce describes him getting an award and the host defending it by saying Liddy embodied the American process, some kind of vague lemonade libertarianism.
So the logic was just, he's popular, so he must be right.
Basically, he had an audience, therefore he must know something. Popularity equals validation.
Sean Hannity's another one Pierce points to. His rise, his show format.
Right, and the title of his book, Deliver Us from Evil, Pierce observes what he calls a distressing glee in anticipating the next crisis because, he suggests, it puts these media figures back in the spotlight. It drives the narrative.
And then there's Michael Savage. Huge audience.
Massive. And Pierce recounts some really, really outrageous statements from the book, like celebrating Yom Kippur with Hitler tapes, which his syndicator apparently dismissed as just being brash, passionate, and smart.
Wow. And his comments on the 4th of July and AIDS. And the autism stuff.
Yeah, the autism comments were particularly nasty, calling autistic children brats or morons, just vicious.
The source mentions the outrage, sponsors pulling out.
Right, but his syndicator defended him, saying Savage was just condensing his multifaceted concerns into 84 seconds.
84 seconds.
Pierce's point is Savage wasn't rewarded despite saying these things, but because people were willing to pay him to say exactly that kind of stuff. That's the three premises right there.
Yeah.
The outrage moved units, he said it loudly, and enough people either believed it or just embraced the fervor.
Okay, but Pierce also shows radio didn't have to be like this, right? He gives a counterexample.
Yeah, a really powerful one, WLAC radio in Nashville.
Oh, I love this part of the book. It sounds incredible.
It really was something else. WLAC, 50,000 watts, carved out this unique niche without big syndicators. DJs like Gene Nobles and John Richburg played what they called race music back then.
Black R&B artists.
Yeah, Amos Milburn, T-Bone Walker, Etta James, Little Richard. Stuff many people in their huge listening area, especially white listeners across the South, would never have heard otherwise.
All night long.
All night long. And the studio sounds like it was chaos, poker, whiskey, setting copy on fire, apparently. They even sold baby chicks over the air.
Baby chicks.
But through the music, John R. and WLAC were doing something profound. Pierce argues they were integrating the country one song at a time across race, class, regional lines.
Jesse Jackson listened growing up, and Hoss Allen, the DJ, who sounded black but was white.
Exactly. It's such a beautiful counterpoint. This was radio that challenged listeners. It changed, as Pierce says, people's hearts before it changed their minds, instead of just reinforcing existing prejudices.
That's a powerful contrast. Okay, so we've got the history, the media amplification. How does this idiot America concept actually show up in specific beliefs and societal fights?
Pierce digs into this with several case studies. Maybe the most vivid is that interception of religion and science, basically personified by the Creation Museum in Kentucky.
Right. His description of arriving there is striking. The gate wasn't even finished. And the cheerful visitors.
Yeah, almost uniformly white and almost uniformly bubbly, arriving in minivans. And the exhibits. Well, they're a direct expression of a very specific, literal interpretation of scripture presented as scientific fact.
Like the dinosaurs on Noah's Ark.
Right. Explained by saying they were young, so they didn't weigh much. Adam and Eve's modesty preserved by convenient shrubbery. And that tricky question of Cain marrying his sister answered with things like there weren't many women around, or everybody was doing it, and basically don't question this.
And Ken Ham's big declaration.
Yeah.
We are taking the dinosaurs back from the evolutionists. And the crowd cheers.
Yeah. Pierce notes the museum really wants mainstream credibility, but he sees it lacking that independent, maybe eccentric imagination of the older cranks, precisely because it demands that mainstream validation. It's a product of the three premises: packaged, popular, presented as fact by fervent believers.
And this connects directly to the Dover, Pennsylvania intelligent design case, right?
Yeah.
Pierce uses that as a key legal battleground.
Absolutely. The school board there shifted, new members talking about prayer, creationism. It got weird, like a maintenance man burning a mural about evolution because it offended his faith.
And he barely got punished. And a board member watched.
Apparently so. Then the textbook fight, ditching the biology book because it was laced with Darwinism.
Their first plan was just straight up creationism.
Yeah, but they couldn't legally. Cases like Lemon v. Kurtzman and Aguillard had already established that teaching creation science in public schools violates the Constitution. It promotes religion, not secular education.
The Lemon test. Secular purpose. Doesn't advance religion. No excessive entanglement.
Exactly. Teaching creationism failed that, so they had to rebrand.
Intelligent design.
Yep. Pierce quotes Gordy Slack saying, Aguillard forced creation science's evolution into a new species, intelligent design. The strategy, pushed by groups like the Moore Center, who called themselves the Christian answer to the ACLU, and wanted to take ID to the Supreme Court to overturn those earlier rulings.
Right.
The strategy was clever, presented as accepting science, but, positing a guiding intelligence. Use democratic-sounding language like, teach the controversy, and make it scientifically unfalsifiable.
Judge Jones, who heard the case, felt the town was basically being used as a test lab for this.
That was his feeling. And the trial itself, Pierce writes, was pretty revealing. School board members sounded like they traded public responsibility for, quote, magic beans. And the main ID proponent, Michael Behe, was apparently just demolished on cross-examination. Had to admit that under his own definition, even astrology could qualify as intelligent design.
Ouch. Judge Jones's comments afterwards really hit the core of Pierce's argument, didn't they? About the press dumbing things down.
Yeah, he felt the punditry led people to think he should just follow the popular will, even if it meant ignoring the law and the science.
And he pointed to all the money and belief pouring into what he called obvious hooey.
Right, like the Left Behind books, fringe interpretations. And later, Ben Stein's movie Expelled, Defending ID, even made these awful links between science and atrocities, like the HMS Beagle at the gates of Auschwitz.
Which just reinforces the idea that it's not really about science.
Exactly. Pierce sees it confirming that ID is fundamentally a moral or religious viewpoint, which is basically what Judge Jones decided.
So the attack on expertise plays out there. What about other stuff, like conspiracy theories? Pierce argues they're also sort of uniquely American.
Yeah, he suggests they blend imagination and reality in this specific way. Like the old cranks, they used to be more on the fringes.
But the NAFTA superhighway theory, that's a prime example of how that changed.
Oh, definitely. It started with some real local resistance to a big road project in Texas, the Trans-Texas Corridor, but it quickly ballooned into this massive conspiracy theory.
Letters to the editor, candidates getting grilled.
State legislatures passing resolutions against a road that, well, didn't actually exist in the way the theory described it.
It had all the classic elements, right? Secret moneymen, foreigners.
Foreign hordes, yeah. Experts are wrong, common sense is right, threat to America, all that.
And figures like Jerome Corsi and Lou Dobbs just ran with it.
Totally amplified this non-existent road, presented it as a real danger. Pierce argues that because of instant communication, you couldn't really debate it logically. It had to be accepted whole. Its reality came straight from that third premise. It existed because enough people fervently believed it did.
Another really painful example Pierce uses is the Flight 93 memorial controversy.
Yeah, the memorial in Pennsylvania for the passengers and crew. Conspiracy theories about 9/11 itself sort of bled into attacks on the memorial's design.
Alec Rawls' theory. Crescent of betrayal.
That's the one. Rawls claimed the crescent shape was a Sikh tribute to radical Islam. Said it pointed to Mecca, the Tower of Voices was a sundial for Muslim prayer times. All sorts of stuff. Glass blocks representing terrorists.
Which weren't even planned. Pierce tells the story of Ed Root, a victim's cousin on the commission, and Thomas Burnett Sr., whose son died on the flight. Burnett Sr. initially listened to Rawls.
Yeah, he said something like, it was hard for me to believe that this was all by accident. Understandable pain and confusion being exploited, perhaps.
So the commission responded. Experts. White papers.
They did. Refuted the claims point by point, even slightly changed the design name from Crescent of Embrace to Arc of Embrace. But Rawls' theory just kept circulating online, causing terrible pain and division for the families. Ed Root refused to shake Rawls' hand.
It just shows how belief can stick, even when debunked.
Exactly. Amplified by communication, causing real harm, regardless of facts.
Okay, moving from belief systems to government action. Pierce argues this war on expertise had truly devastating consequences, especially leading up to the Iraq War.
He really focuses on this. He highlights the experience of Louise Richardson, a terrorism expert. She'd actually warned the government before 9/11 about planes being used as missiles.
Wow. And after 9/11,
She met with the Pentagon, offered decades of expertise, and was basically ignored for 7 years.
7 years.
Yep. While she and other experienced academics were shut out, she describes these newly minted experts pontificating, being dismissive of actual knowledge. The narrative for war was already being built.
Pierce connects this back to Madison again, the warning about war and executive power.
Yeah, that war is in fact the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. And also George Reedy's point about the isolating trap a president creates, limiting dissenting views.
Paul Pillar from the CIA's INR saw this happening.
Yeah, he described the lead-up feeling like walking into a foregone conclusion. Few outside checks. Events became, quote, novelized.
Novelized, meaning twisted into a story, like fiction.
Exactly. Reality shaped to fit a narrative arc. Ground zero to Kabul to Baghdad. Needed a strong plot, a credible narrator, like Colin Powell at the UN.
Pierce notes the cynicism there. Cheney telling Powell his image would dazzle the rubes.
Yeah, reportedly. And the details filling this novel, often pure fiction.
Like the Al-Qaeda-Iraq connection that wasn't there?
Yeah.
Or the nuclear program?
Right. The Niger Yellow Cake documents are a perfect example of this purest novelization, Pierce calls it. Fake documents about Niger selling uranium to Iraq get passed around by intelligence agencies.
And because it fit the story they wanted to tell?
It was accepted, or pretended to be accepted, became a source of noisy subplots and utter fiction, even though it was debunked internally fairly quickly by some.
Anthony Zinni, the retired general, he saw this lack of planning, contempt for expertise.
Yeah, he attended meetings, saw a lack of real plans, and this contempt for those who had actual military strategy experience. People focused on minimizing casualties.
And when he spoke out?
Ignored. Called a traitor, even. Pierce quotes Zinni saying the country wandered into this war, eyes half closed, too willingly sold a narrative. The failure of real debate, the bullying. Regret came later, Pierce notes, from both sides. Narrative trumped expertise. Again.
Another incredibly powerful example Pierce uses is the Terry Schiavo case, a personal tragedy turned into a political and media circus.
Yeah, Pierce really focuses on the hospice workers at Woodside, where Terry was. Annie Santa Maria, the director, she'd seen family fights before, but this external frenzy was something else entirely.
Checkpoints, hidden cameras, protesters, monks, politicians.
A total circus. And the staff, Annie, Mike Bell, Louise Cleary, they were horrified that Terry's actual health and well-being became the least important factor.
Their professional work just got weaponized.
Completely. Weaponized for politics, for media ratings. Annie felt like they were acting out someone else's script. Called it reminiscent of Cuba, where manufactured reality took over.
And the facts just didn't seem to matter. The family telling different stories, the press running with it.
Right. The hospice staff apparently knew what angle the family was pushing based on their media appearances that day. Debate was just drowned out by this noisy public frenzy.
They were called murderers.
Yeah.
Told to repent.
Yeah. And false claims just got amplified. People with maybe tangential medical connections making claims about Terry walking or talking, accusations about her care, a former nurse making claims of poisoning and things Michael Schiavo supposedly claims Judge Greer had already dismissed, but they were still aired on national TV.
Pierce mentions that political memo calling a case a political godsend for Republicans.
Right. Initially blamed on Democrats, but a staffer for Mel Martinez confessed. And Pierce points out the political fallout. Bill Frist didn't run again. Tom DeLay got indicted. Democrats took the House in 2006. The political agenda used the frenzy and was then impacted by it.
Okay, another huge area, climate change denial. Pierce highlights Senator James Inhofe.
Yeah, Inhofe chaired the Environment Committee, famously called global warming a hoax, ranked it right up there with the separation of church and state as another hoax.
And Pierce just contrasts that with, well, reality.
Pesky scientific data, melting ice, tropical diseases moving north, the troublesome reality of climate change, and, the actual writings of the founders on church and state, which kind of refute Inhofe's other hoax.
Inhofe had that report about 400 scientists disputing the consensus.
Right. Pierce notes the list included weathermen, economists, people with zero climate expertise, and Inhofe invited Michael Crichton, the novelist, to testify before the committee as an expert.
Pierce draws a direct line to the tobacco industry's playbook here.
Absolutely. He references historians like Proctor and Brandt describing the strategy, deliberately create doubt, sustain controversy, disrupt the consensus, even when the science is overwhelming. Like Clarence Cook Little did for tobacco, using his credentials to muddle the scientific evidence.
And then Pierce brings this down to earth, devastatingly. Shishmaref, Alaska.
This is where the consequences aren't theoretical at all. Shishmaref is an Inupiaq village, barrier island, Chukchi Sea, totally reliant on their environment, but climate change is literally washing them away.
The ice is late, it's soft, permafrost is thawing.
The coastline is eroding like crazy, hundreds of feet, gone, much of it recently. Stronger storms batter the coast, wrecking homes, boats. John Sinnock remembers hills from his childhood. They're just gone.
Lucian Ingewook says global warming is a new term, but the reality is undeniable, unpredictability.
Yeah. They build seawalls, but Tom Lee, a resident, says maybe it buys 10, 15 years. They know they have to move for the kids. There's literally no room left on the island.
Pierce links this to the bigger issue of environmental refugees.
Yeah, Norman Myers estimated millions already, maybe hundreds of millions eventually. The UN recognizes them. Places like Tuvalu relocating people to New Zealand, facing cultural loss.
And Shishmaref is one of the first in North America, but moving is slow.
Very slow. Small population, high cost, not seen as a huge national benefit compared to projects for big cities. So less help. It's the real-world impact of the denial, the manufactured narratives.
Pierce explicitly calls it the politicization of science. Mentions Elizabeth Blackburn, the biologist whose funding got questioned.
Right, and a House committee report on the administration manipulating climate science. Even an internal American Petroleum Institute memo basically outlining the tobacco strategy. Create doubt.
James Spieth, the environmental expert, points out how complex science is in policy, how hard it is to believe bad things you can't see.
And how easy denial is when someone powerful tells you it's not happening.
So finally, Pierce pulls all these threads together in the modern political arena, looking at the 2008 election.
Yeah, he sees kind of a missed opportunity early on, like at that Rick Warren forum. Both Obama and McCain were there, getting asked questions rooted in specific religious views, like Warren asking Obama about when a baby gets human rights. Pierce sees Warren vetting candidates as a sign of the times.
And he paints John McCain's campaign shift as basically embracing idiot America.
Hiring people who'd attacked him before, changing positions on his own bills, going quiet on stuff like torture, Pierce argues.
He characterizes the Republican Party, then, as the party of undigested charlatans. Some may be sincere but wrong, like supply-side voodoo believers. Others just.
Dinosaurs with saddles is his phrase. The focus, he argues, was on votes, niche marketing to fervent believers, prioritizing the frontier of the mind over substance. He suggests you had to become a preposterous figure to run.
At that moment in the New Hampshire debate, Republican candidates denying evolution, the audience cheering.
Yeah, Tancredo, Brownback, Huckabee. For Pierce, that wasn't just a slip-up. He argues it should have been disqualifying or at least made people pause about the party. But no, it was just about hitting the right marks, getting the applause. Expertise was irrelevant.
Then the torture debate in South Carolina, Brit Hume's hypothetical ticking time bomb.
That melodramatic, post-apocalyptic hypothetical. And Tom Tancredo jumps in with, I'm looking for Jack Bauer, audience explodes.
Which brings in the TV show 24.
Yep. Pierce calls 24 impeccably crafted, says it captured the zeitgeist, but also labels it the first attempt at successfully mass marketing torture porn.
And critically, this fictional show gets used to justify real policy.
Absolutely. Cited by John Yoo in the torture memos. Even Justice Scalia used Jack Bauer to justify torture, saying Bauer saved Los Angeles in the show, so no jury going to convict him for breaking the law.
Wow. A TV show driving legal arguments. But even 24 faded.
Yeah, Forbes.com noted maybe that kind of reality programming had peaked.
And the producers themselves admitted.
They told the Wall Street Journal the show was struggling because torture seemed less popular. Ratings tracked Bush's approval numbers. Jane Mayer's reporting made them sound like, quote, braying jackasses.
So the key point Pierce makes is the show wasn't changed because torture is wrong or illegal.
No, but because it couldn't hold an audience anymore. That reality TV, dynamic teams, drama, fervor as truth had shifted.
And Pierce argues that dynamic is now just baked into politics and culture.
Totally. Choosing sides, drafting politicians who fit the story, drafting experts based on agreement or sales, drafting blowhards to make the team feel good, facts optional.
So wrapping up, Pierce's core problem is a nation applying the rules of fiction to reality.
Yeah, a disordered nation confusing truth with popularity, with narrative, with fervor.
And the consequences are real. Lost debates on huge issues like Chiavo or Iraq, real places like Shishmaref, ignored because their reality doesn't fit the preferred story.
Right. He comes back to that American demand to know, the obligation citizens have. He suggests even when it leads to, searching for Atlantis, that spark shouldn't be scorned.
But he ends with this lament, doesn't he?
Yeah. That there are people who know things, dedicated academics, experienced generals like Zinni, compassionate professionals like the hospice staff. But the nation, he feels, sometimes just doesn't prove worthy of them.
It's a really powerful and, sobering journey through the book's argument. We've seen Pierce's take on the crank evolving, enabled by media and those three premises.
We've looked at how this war on expertise plays out: science, religion, politics, policy, how narratives and agendas can just overwhelm facts.
It really forces you, the listener, to think about how easily popularity and loudness can replace evidence, how compelling stories, even fictional ones, shape how we see reality.
Absolutely. And why does understanding this landscape matter to you? Well, it affects everything. What's taught in schools, the news you consume, how huge crises get handled. It's the fabric of public life.
It demands this constant conscious effort from all of us, doesn't it? To sort out genuine inquiry, the kind Madison hoped for, from just noise, from manufactured reality driven by clicks or ratings or just sheer belief.
Yeah, it's work.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on Madison's hope for citizens who can tell good ideas from crazy ones. In a world where, as Pierce argues, the lines between fact, feeling, and entertainment are so blurred, and reality itself often feels up for grabs, what does it actually mean for you to be an informed citizen today?
Yeah.
And where do you stand in that ongoing, really challenging American experiment?